put out their card.
They could go first, like public comment, but maybe just give them as much time as they want.
Well,
Like
I
10
didn't-
minutes. What if I... You have one?
Let me get on that.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. We're going to bring the special meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee to order. We have a quorum, and for those who follow this committee, and you're not aware, we have 2 additional members on this committee at this time. But our quorum is, we have Mr. Weezar, Mr. Zine, Mr. Smith, Mr. Koretz, Ms. Perry, and Mr. Zine, and myself, Bernard Parks, as the chair, Mr. Rosenthal. So we have all 7 members here. One of the things, just for those that are addressing the timing issue, what our intent is to go through the presentations of the CAO and the CLA and get the overview of the budget. We also intend to have a discussion on revenues before getting to the departments. There's a possibility that even though we have agendized that we may not get to every department that's on the agenda, and so we will play that by ear. But the big issue today for us is to get through the presentations. There's a PowerPoint presentation and from the CAO, but to really get an in-depth knowledge as to where we are on the revenues. It's my intent also is that those that put in public comment cards, that we will have a public comment before we get into the presentation so that staff could hear your public comment and address them as they're going through it. If you put in a card for a specific department, we're not going to call that at this time. What we'll do is call specific cards for departments at the time those departments are coming up for review. So today our mission is to address the larger issue of the budget, get the overview, and then from there an in-depth discussion on revenues, because it's in my judgment that we can't move forward on the overall budget until we have some consensus as to what are the real revenues we're going to be dealing with. So with that, what I'd like to do is if I call your name, that you come up to the podium and get in line so we can go through, and we'll give 2 minutes on the open comment. Mr. McQuiston, Arkur Patel, Benjamin Pazzillo. So if you just line up there, and as each speaker finishes, I will add others. But if you can just, your 2 minutes, and we, certainly the clock is running now, so thank you. Mr.
Jim McQuiston, you have my statement. I've gone through the budget only generally at first, and that's just a general statement. As you know in there, I've outlined several very major sources of income which are not in the budget right now. We've talked about some of these for over the years, and it's about time that we did something about that. The other thing I do want to mention, the controller's report in the Blue Book is for last year instead of this year, but of course you all have this year's controller's report. You know that his or her report has a lower income by $100,000 or $100 million than the very generous CAO estimate. And obviously, the CAO was under a lot of pressure this year. The budget does not agree with the numbers in the April 9th fourth financial estimate report, and yet they were both prepared about the same time. So there are a lot of things to be worked out, and I'll be working, trying to find some more revenue besides the almost $700 million in funds that we could be collecting this year if the mayor really applied himself.
Yes, next. And also Jacob Miller, if you can come in line.
Ankur Patel. Salaries make up a large part of the budget. There are many positions in the budget that are just listed as one position, and then there's a salary range for that one position. This is tightening the belt. We need to make sure that each position has a specific salary, not a range of salaries. I think that's very important. That's all. And actually, Councilman, I think the people would appreciate it if you lowered your own salaries from the $178,000 that you get per year. That could be...
Thank you very much.
People would support.
Next line is Stacy Dancy. Come in line.
Council members, I am Benjamin Pizzillo of the Engineers and Architects Association. Eliminating EAA positions at LAPD and implementing furloughs on LAPD EAA members will only further deplete the resources available for the most vital service our municipality provides. Furloughs of EAA civilians at LAPD have already caused increased backlogs in fingerprint analysis and delays in crime scene processing from understaffing of the photography unit. From paychecks to CompStat to grant funding research and performance auditing, furloughing EAA will hamper productivity at LAPD. At the Emergency Management Department, EAA positions make up the majority of the staff. EAA staff at EMD work diligently preparing this city to be self-sustaining for whatever emergency we face. In conclusion, our city's commitment to public safety must include EAA, and an EAA unfettered from furloughs and reductions serves everyone's interests. Thank you.
You're allowed to build. You're allowed to build.
Good afternoon. My name is Jacob Miller. I work for Los Angeles City Animal Services for the last 8.5 years. Coming here to speak to you guys about how important we are and how important we are to public safety. Public safety is one of our prime core duties to the City of Los Angeles. There is talk about closing one of the animal shelters, and for that I have to say it's not going to save you any money. Closing an animal shelter simply means that these animals are either going to be moved to another shelter, people are going to have to drive further to bring these animals to that shelter, and in a lot of cases they're just going to ditch them. Take for example when we replaced the old East Valley Animal Shelter with the new one. That one had a replacement that was even a larger shelter than the old one, but people were still ditching animals at the old site. We're going to be seeing this happen if one of these animal shelters closes. The animals are still going to continue to come in. There's still going to be an added cost to the city for this, and we're going to be seeing an increase of animals running around the city. It's going to come back to these times where you're going to be afraid to walk out your door because more and more aggressive dogs are going to be out in the city biting children, biting the elderly, biting the people that are most vulnerable and most in need of these services. It's very important that we keep this up. We also provide an important role as early intervention for children. I believe that if we teach our children how to, if our department is allowed to teach our children of the city how to properly take care of animals, you're not going to be seeing as many people, abusing animals as children and later becoming serial killers. These things really do happen. It's very important that we take notice of this. It all has a cascading effect. So once again, I want to let all of you know that animal services is vital to public safety, and even a minor cut to us, because we are already down to the bare bone, is going to have cascading negative effects. Thank you very much.
Next in line would be Simboa Wright, and then Artemio Risotto.
Good afternoon. Stacy Dancy, LA Animal Services, East Valley Field Officer. Our department has approximately 48 active field officers that cover our city from the San Fernando Valley to San Pedro and all in between. That's 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It's not difficult to do the math to realize that 48 active officers covering the city and 6 shelters where we've been stretched very thin. As officers, we provide public safety to our citizens, assist LAPD, LAFD, and other departments. We are federally mandated as first responder for all disasters. We rescue and impound injured, sick, and distressed animals, impound dangerous and attacking animals, wild, domestic, or exotic, conduct and prosecute humane investigations, conduct and prosecute dangerous animal investigations, as well as numerous other duties. Our officers have been on mandatory furloughs, which has crippled our response times into the emergencies, while LAPD or FD are waiting for one of the officers in the field to respond for an assist. While they're waiting, they become impatient and try to find solutions to handle the situation themselves. Lately, on several occasions, I roll up to a call for an LAPD assist, and to arrive there and finding them with the shotguns at the ready and hands-on holsters. We as officers are the animal experts and never have to use a firearm to impound a dog. However, with short staffing, it is increasingly difficult for the 1 or 2 officers to cover the emergencies in the field and the loads that are present. Furloughs and have not been handled in a timely manner. They're not allowing us to complete our investigations. I could go on, but the bottom line is that our job is to provide public safety for our citizens and the animals. It is crucial that our city is a safe and responsible city, staffed with experts trained to respond professionally and immediately to the needs of our citizens. Thank you for your time.
Dr. Clyde Williams, next in line.
Hi, I'm Samuel Wright, City of Los Angeles Wastewater Collections. A couple of weeks ago, I had an emergency situation. I was working in the South District, District 8, and we had a Department of Water and Power transistor blow up right at the bus stop where we were working at. Immediately, I pressed the emergency red button on the radio in the vehicle. No response. I'm still waiting on the response. I guess because of the furloughs, the operator is unable to respond to emergency situations. I believe that emergency button is there for a reason, to protect not only the public but to protect us, city employees. What are we going to do if we add more furloughs or try to lay off some of these employees that are part of public safety that are non-sworn? We have to think about that. Thank you.
Next in line, Nina Royale.
Yes, sir. My name is Artemio Risotto. I work for Property Division, LAPD, and I'd like to speak to you about my department, which is one of the smallest in the city. But we are an integral part of the chain of custody, because we keep inventory and process evidence. Some raw numbers that I would like to share with you is, as far as money is concerned, we processed $6 million for 2009. We also priced firearms $6,300 for last year. And then we burned, this month we burned 14,000 pounds. It's roughly equivalent to 8 tons of narcotics this month. And what I'd like to say here is, although we are a small department, we are providing a vital service to the city in the department. And we also have a project that could save, it's being studied by the LAPD higher-ups right now. It's a project that could save the city about at least $3 million a year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next in line, Dr. Wiseman.
Dr. Clyde Williams, El Sereno, Northeast LA. Shared sacrifices. We heard that last year. What are we going to hear next year? How many more sacrifices? Still, it's the central issue as to not DWP, but the LA Fire Department, LA Police Department. How much will they contribute to the shared sacrifices? Just to give an order of magnitude, it would be equivalent to DWP raising our rates by, say, $40 a month for each month. So that's the level of magnitude. We're talking about a large amount of money, and it's going to get even worse next year. But we don't hear about next year and the year following and the year following that, except by the one presentation by the CAO, which I wish he would repeat, especially based upon next year. Okay, revenue generation. How about $2,000 to $3,000 per parking space in all private parking lots? I can park all day for $3 a day in Chinatown. So, hey, there seems to be some money available there. So $2,000 to $3,000, get it up to, quotes, major cities, budget size. How about keeping the current parking rates the same, because that provides retail, not the commuters. So we have several opportunities. I myself would also prefer that brush clearance be privatized and or made self-sufficient, and especially taking out the redeployment of the fire department and keeping it on prevention rather than curing. So, and one last thing, a scorecard. Each department, level of service, cost, number of positions this year, next year, and the year following. Thank you.
Thank you. Next in line is Ken Krupnik. Oh, no, Ms. Royal? No, you're next. I'm just getting somebody in behind you. We're getting in the queue. Where's Dr. Wiseman? Okay, you're next.
Good afternoon. My name is Nina Royal. I am a member of Saving LA Project as well as Budget LA, and I'm the safety chairman for the San Latahunga Neighborhood Council. And a couple of things. I noticed that there are duplication of services and departments, like the Department of Emergency Management and the Fire Department's Disaster Preparedness Unit. They put out duplicate classes, they do duplicate brochures. When I say duplicate, the same information, only their own brochures. That's extremely costly. Also, we should be able to use volunteers. I spoke to one of the deputy chiefs yesterday, and in their Topanga station, their detective bureau, they have a lot of volunteers working there, which frees up the police department. We should be looking at those type of services. Also, I think that the city should just quit lying. We have been lied to regarding the taxes for the trash collection, which is supposed to be to bring the, have us pay for our trash, which we weren't doing before, but we were told that it was going for the police and the fire department, not the fire department, the sheriff's department. They were both out there toting how this tax should be collected and it was going to go. People are angry, and we have a right to be angry. If people are upfront about what's actually going on, then we can deal with it. Another thing is that the city is still spending money. Where are you getting the money to spend for festivals and things like that when we're broke? We should be tightening our belt and seeing where we're at and stop all expenditures until we know exactly where we're at. It's like Dr. Tom said, it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. So we really need to work on these things. Thank you.
Next, Doctor, you next, and then Mr. And then third in line would be Fred Dowell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a time for generalities, and I hope to hear a good deal of ideas for general methods of solving this budget crisis that we're in. We're still in a crisis for fiscal year 2009-2010, which is our current year, and I know you know that full well. Some of what I'm about to say is as applicable to this year as it will be to next year. We've heard shared sacrifice and responsibility, a wonderful set of slogans that were put forward last year, and we still need to put those ideas forth and maybe even do something about it. Everything should be on the table is another slogan, and here again, when we come before you, we who try to represent the public would like to see some evidence that you have received and are considering all the suggestions, especially the one I give you. That's another story. Now, there are global concerns to be worried about today, and the biggest ones, I think, involved this first 6 months of every year. We are short money every month because our big incomes come in December and January and thereafter in property tax and business tax, which is in February. You just went through a very serious discussion of the DWP, which has not yet given their transfer fund for power to the city. I proposed before, and I would propose again, that the DWP be asked to put that power transfer in the hands of the city in July, not in May. The reason for that is that will decrease the second of our two big cash accounts. The biggest cash account, of course, is general fund. Another one is our cash flow account called the TRAN, and to get $200 million to defray that would be very valuable. Thank you so much.
And next would be LaShawn Wiggers.
Councilman, Councilwoman, and Budget and Finance. This here is the face that you see when there's an emergency in this city. When there's a major disaster, or one of you gets shot, or your constituents or your family in your neighborhoods, I am the one that responds. I'm an EMS battalion captain. I know you never get to talk to them because we're busy. We don't show up. But I'm here just to tell you that I have nothing to gain from this. I'm soon to retire. Got 33 years doing this paramedic rescue. It's a passion for me. It's never been a job. It's a calling. EMS is 83% of the fire department workload. There are 16 currently EMS positions, EMS battalion captain positions. You're about to cut it down to 7 positions. Each of those positions at the 16 cover 50 EMTs that they supervise. In other words, firefighters and their captains that aren't necessarily paramedics, most of them aren't. The amount of lawsuits that we avert as EMS supervisors is enormous. Our other position is also Terrorism Liaison Officer, TLO. I know Chief Parks or Councilmember Parks that you know what that is. Most of you don't. We're the liaison between JRIG and our fellow firefighters. We digest all the information on a daily basis and then spit it back out to our members so they know what's going on. When there's a shooting or there's a major traffic accident, this is the face they see.
Thank you very much. Next would be Mr. Dahl, and then LaShawn Wiggers.
Hi, good afternoon.
Oh, there you go.
Basically, I think that she's right behind me. I can't see her well. Basically, I know that everything's been, you guys are talking about public safety, but I'd like for all of you to think about that all of the departments within the city of Los Angeles offer safety with whatever they do, whether it's police, fire, sanitation, record parks. We all offer a safe haven and our parks on our streets for the patrons and the children of Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you. Next in line would be Luis Trinidad and Cheryl Parisi.
Hello, my name is LaShawn Wiggers, and I'm a director at a facility of a licensed facility for rec and parks. And with these proposed budget cuts are going to endanger the lives of our future children. Cutting these facilities, licensed child care centers, are going to have a public safety impact where the children aren't going to have anywhere to go. Parents rely on our services on a day-to-day basis. We provide an after-school program for children 5 to 13 from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m., which allows the parents to be productive citizens, not to rely on the state. They can be productive and go to work every day, and they know they have a safe and nurturing place for their children to go. And if you cut out all the licensed child care centers that are being proposed, you're going to harm the families of this city. You're going to really harm them because they're not going to have an affordable place to go where their children can grow and learn. All of the staff that are at the child care centers are educated love children and have patience for children. And if you let these children run the streets, this is going to harm them. There are a lot of predators out there who have harm in their mind. So these facilities offer a valuable place for the children to come to. So I please hope that you think about the cuts that are being proposed with these licensed child care centers and all the facilities that are being proposed for cuts. It's a public safety issue. You don't want children running the streets. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Trinidad.
Good afternoon. My name is Louis Trinidad. I'm an equipment mechanic for Motor Transport Division, Los Angeles Police Department. Basically, I had just looked over the mayor's budget, and it's quite amazing that I see that he's playing Russian roulette with the public safety. As we all know, that it takes 5 minutes. If you have a heart attack and you stop breathing and blood stops flowing, it takes 5 minutes before you become brain damaged.
You should have seen Greg in
The police department is one of the first responders, and if they can't get there within a reasonable amount of time, you will be brain dead, and you're actually putting the public at harm's way. Now, in Motor Transport Division, it has come to the point now for every police vehicle that comes in, if it needs a specific item, we have to get prior authorization whether to do it or not. Our budget for parts at this time is either exhausted or near exhausted, and we're not at the end of the year yet, budget year. So I really don't understand this, but my suggestion for the City Council is to really weigh this, because you're not just talking about people, the workers of the City of Los Angeles. You are talking about the safety of the city, of your constituents. And that not only includes me, but also the fire department, because their budgets are being damaged. So I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Last card. Cheryl Parise, I didn't realize, Cheryl, are you coming up with Julie and Victor as a group?
That'd be great. Perfect. Perfect.
Let me just say that we'll put you on your best behavior. We're going to give, because if you came up individually, you'd have 6 minutes, so we'll put 6 on the clock, and you can discipline yourself as to how you separate the time.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Cheryl Parisi. I'm the chair of the Coalition of City Unions. We represent collectively 22,000 city workers. I'm joined by leaders of other national unions that are part of the coalition, Julie Butcher from SEIU, Victor Gordo from Labor 777. We, together, have been engaging and attacking the city's fiscal challenges for more than 2 years. We, together, have created a structural foundation, and we believe real flexibility for attacking this year's problems. Thanks to cooperation between the city and its workers, LA is now facing a manageable problem, not a catastrophe. We came up together with a smart retirement program and concessions that helped the city through this year, one of the toughest on record. Our work together has already improved the city's position in this budget by over $112 million. If we had not reached that agreement last year, the city would be addressing a shortfall of nearly $600 million rather than $485 million. But our agreement has paved the way for more than $112 million in savings. This week, we ask you to take full advantage of the concessions that workers agreed to last year. Doing so will improve the city budget, keep LA working, and allow us to retain a few more basic services for our residents. We have put on the table our blueprint for a strong budget for Los Angeles. These are ideas presented to maximize revenue and improve city operations. in the interest of maintaining frontline services. These include ideas for holding banks accountable in our current foreclosure crisis to maintain the quality of neighborhoods. We are advocating for aggressive collections to make certain that those who choose to not shoulder their responsibilities are required to pay up and to level the playing field for honest businesses. And to prioritize the delivery of frontline services. These are the services that every resident and every taxpayer of the City of Los Angeles relies upon. We believe that the challenge in this budget is incumbent upon us to figure out together smart ways to retain the delivery of frontline services. We ask of you as we proceed during these hearings over the next couple of weeks that in the spirit of partnership, that we be given the opportunity for meaningful participation in each of the decisions and each of the discussions on the many issues that will be confronting this committee. Again, we have presented, we've met with you and your staff. We have presented ideas. We would like the opportunity to flesh them out during the context, when appropriate, in the hearings. Thank you.
Thank you. I think when Mr. Santana comes up, he's going to comment as to when the CAO will have a response. Okay? Thank you. Okay, last public comment, Art Sweatman. On the other cards that are specifically identified departments, we'll hold those until we get to those departments. So this is the last public comment.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Art Sweatman. I am a tree surgeon with the Department of Public Works, Bureau of Street Services. What the mayor's proposing right now is a major reduction in the tree trimming service in the city of Los Angeles. He's going to hand that over to the citizens and business owners to trim their own trees. Now, guys, right now we have about 700,000 trees in the city of Los Angeles, and we've been able to maintain about 40,000 of those per year, but that service is going to be cut now. We respond to about 1,800 tree emergencies per month, but those numbers greatly spike when we have any sort of weather events. And, you know, a weather event here in Los Angeles is a little wind blowing, a little rain falling, and all of a sudden we have a catastrophe on our hands. Our response time right now to tree emergencies is about 24 hours. If we reduce these services, we're going to be looking at over 72 hours in response time. And that means trees down in homes, trees down blocking roads, preventing emergency vehicles from getting through. That means trees down on cars. These are services that we just can't afford to lose. We also respond greatly to LAPD's requests to trim trees to make sure that street visibility is available to them so that suspects can't hide behind trees or under trees when the police helicopters are flying overhead. Guys, these cuts are not a solution, and this is going to hinder what the citizens expect here. They expect a quality of life here in Los Angeles, and trees are part of that infrastructure. Trees are a benefit to us in Los Angeles, but they have to be maintained, just like owning a vehicle. If you own a vehicle and you don't change its oil, it's going to, that vehicle isn't going to be very trustworthy. But if you have a tree out front of your house and it's not being maintained, it's not going to be a benefit anymore. It's going to be a hazard. So I please ask you for your consideration on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to the agenda now and ask the mayor's office, the CAO, and the CLA to come to the table so we can have the initial presentation of the 10-11 budget. If I understand, Mr. Santana, you have a PowerPoint.
Right. Is the mayor's office going to go first, or how did you want to handle it?
Okay, let the mayor's office go first, and then the CAO, and then the CLA.
Good afternoon, Chairman Parks and honorable members of the Budget and Finance Committee. My name is Ben Ceja, Deputy Mayor of Budget and Finance for Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. I'm honored to present to you the Mayor's proposed budget for the 2010-11 fiscal year. I will keep my comments brief because there are a great number of questions I'm sure you want to ask and which I will do my best to answer. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge and thank everyone that has played a role in developing this budget. Everyone in the Mayor's office and in particular my budget team. the staff at the CAO, and each and every department of the city. Even through all the adversity and uncertainty, the hard work and dedication demonstrated by the fiscal and administrative personnel of this city is a testament to the strong regard for public service as a privilege, motivation, desire, creativity, and work ethic that exists here in the city. This proposed budget is one that has been developed under a new economic reality that, as the mayor stated a week ago, is pitting the cruel irony of the growing needs of Angelinos against the declining capacity of their own government to answer their needs. Today we begin to discuss the mayor's proposed plan of action to keep Los Angeles solvent under this new economic reality, all while preserving core services that are so critical to our residents. The proposed $6.7 billion budget we will discuss is one that addresses our $485 million deficit in the upcoming fiscal year with a combination of ongoing spending reductions and conservative revenue increases, and yes, one-time expenditure deferrals and revenues. More importantly, the proposed budget is one that can be implemented on day one of the fiscal year. Learning from our collective experience a year ago and throughout the current fiscal year, it is important for the mayor to provide you with a budget and a path that relies on ongoing structural changes to address our structural deficit, changes that as city's management we can implement. The mayor and I am sure everyone here is thankful for what we have been able to accomplish working with our labor partners in the current fiscal year. But as I mentioned earlier, our collective experience has taught us that we must have a balanced budget that is built on actions under our control. To be more specific, this means eliminating positions, mandating unpaid days off, and yes, laying off employees. But let me be clear, in the words of the mayor, we can do better. The proposed budget before you represents one version of our future, forced on us by the economic downturn and the past failures to live within our means. These layoffs and service cuts proposed will be severe, and they will be painful, but we can do better. We can avoid many of these tough cuts, and we can find better ways to protecting our fiscal health and balancing our budget. But to do so, we must all share in the sacrifice to stop the cuts in services and prevent further layoffs. We must all be willing to take the cuts in our pay, increase our pension contribution, and contribute more to our health care plans. This is the approach we should take to successfully address our budget deficit and prepare us to deal with our new economic reality. However, as we found out this year, it's extremely difficult to budget in a shared sacrifice target when not everyone is willing to share in the sacrifice. Thus, we have before you is a budget with the painful cuts, with the layoffs, and with the service reductions. But despite all the cuts before you, the proposed budget funds the core services of the city and provides a beginning path towards fiscal sustainability. It funds our first obligation, public safety. It continues to fight against gang violence. It protects our basic infrastructure by maintaining streets. It forges new partnerships with the private sector, and it balances our expectations with our resources. It is balanced by using 7% of cuts and revenue changes that are structural and just 30% that are one-time. And by the end of the fiscal year, this budget anticipates setting aside 6.5% of the general fund, or $284 million for the reserve fund. The budget also builds on the hard work that has already occurred in the city to retire employees and to transfer employees from the general fund positions to special fund and proprietary departments. The fact that we have moved the number of potential layoffs from the up to 4,000 number to something less than 900 should not be lost in our discussions. Nevertheless, even with these positives, we can do better. This is why in presenting this budget, you will not find me defending reductions or layoffs for ideological purposes or reasons. If there are better ways of getting ongoing structural savings than those that we have proposed, we welcome those ideas, provided that these ideas undergo a level of review that will ensure that we are not continuing the cycle of deferring difficult decisions and prolonging our crisis. I also caution on the reliance of overly optimistic revenue assumptions that may not come to fruition. Furthermore, it is statistically probable, and in fact highly likely, that in the $6.7 billion budget, a few items may have been missed or lost in translation. There may even be some outright errors. That is why the process we begin today is so important. We realize there may be areas of policy disagreement in this budget, and my team and I will be forceful advocates for the mayor's policies and programs. But having said that, we also pledge to work with you, the CLA, and the CAO as we work through these differences together. It's my hope that in working together with you, the City Council and the Mayor will be able to enact a budget that all hopes our shared commitment to responsible fiscal stewardship financial stability, restates our values, reiterates our principles, and reclaims our status as a center of progress and prosperity long into the future. The mayor's proposed budget is now before you, and on behalf of the mayor, look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, any questions of the mayor's office before we go to the CEO, or we can deal with the questions as a group?
Question about the reserve, and I'm not sure if to ask it then when that item comes up or...
I think what we can do, if we want to hear all of the presentation, then come back with questions and just identify who you want to answer that.
I'll do that.
Thanks. Mr. Santana?
Good afternoon. Let me start off by saying that this budget was really, we started this budget early this year. While these are the formal budget hearings, much of the work of your committee and the council and the mayor really has had a significant impact in our projections for the next year. If you recall, if we could go to the next slide, if you could recall, back in February, when we presented the financial status report, we demonstrated that while we had done a tremendous amount of work in partnering with our labor unions to identify concessions across the board, many of which that you heard about earlier today, that unfortunately the recession had a much larger impact on our budget than anticipated. So what we identified was a significant drop in our revenue beyond what was projected in our budget. Next slide. At that point in time, we made a series of recommendations that most of which your council had adopted. It was within a context of a 3-year strategy, and the objective was to engage you early on in the process so that we not only start addressing this year's problem, but make significant progress in addressing the anticipated deficit for the following year. And so as a result of that work, the transfers that occurred from individuals from the general fund to the special fund, the unfortunate layoffs of over 100 employees, and the early retirement program, as well as the austerity measures that were adopted by your council and the mayor, we were able to identify approximately $62 million of additional revenue to help mitigate this year's shortfall. The remaining shortfall that we will close the budget with this year is approximately $146 million. And while still significant, it's important to note that we've come a long way. And unfortunately, that is something that this city does not get the credit for. It doesn't get the credit for the hard work that you have done as a committee in addressing the deficit as it grew. And because of your work, the amount that we need to dip into the reserve is significantly less than what we projected. We will hope to end this year's budget with a reserve fund of approximately $121 million, which is still not where it should be, but is much better than was anticipated early on when we presented the financial status report. So we began this year's budget with following many of the same principles that were laid out in the course of the work that was done this year. The goals continue to be to reduce the structural deficit, to protect core services, to develop a flexible funding strategy so the budget could expand and contract based on the changing realities of the new economy, to rebuild a reserve, and to recognize conservatively that any new revenue that was developing as a result of this improving economy. In context, it's important to look at the budget within the last several years. This budget, while not significantly different in aggregate as last year's budget, includes additional costs that are part of the course of doing business. Those costs include increased pension costs and healthcare costs across the board. So this budget in total is estimated, proposed to be $6.7 billion, 36% of that, or $2.3 billion, being from the special funds, and 64% of it being, or $4.3 billion, being from the general fund. The general fund portion of the budget is less than what it was 10 years ago when it was at 67% of the overall budget. But what you'll find is that the overall budget pretty much stays stagnant in terms of the revenue that it recognizes, there is still a significant reduction in the workforce to address the structural elements of our problem. In the last 10 years, what this budget proposes is the smallest workforce that we've had. Back in 1999-2000, we had a workforce of over 34,000 employees, 808. This year's budget includes 3,400 employees and 91. There's been a significant decline, particularly in the area of general fund civilians, which include 27% of the workforce in this proposed budget, approximately 9,000 employees, compared to where it was 10 years ago at 36% of the workforce and over 12,000 employees. This chart, better than any, demonstrates the significant reduction in the size of the workforce that is being proposed for the future. And it's this reduction that presents itself as a solution to the overall structural deficit that the city has been encountering. As I indicated, much of the solutions that are identified in the proposed budget were actually adopted this fiscal year. That includes the eliminations of positions, the fire deployment plan, the significant reduction in overtime and other concessions within the police department, and of course the early retirement program. In total, they approximate over $220 million. Overall, as the budget, next slide please, the budget deficit is now projected at $492 million, with solutions that range from 44% in cost reductions, $63 million in unpaid days, or approximately 13% of the budget, 11% of the budget of one-time revenue, about $53 million, and 30%, about $154 million worth of ongoing revenues. Next slide, please. This budget certainly contains a tremendous amount of pain within our city family and a significant curtailment of city services. This is just a snapshot of what that represents. When you combine both the reduction in positions as well as the furloughs that are being proposed, there's in the Department of Street Services, for example, it represents nearly a 40% reduction in their general fund. In cultural affairs is about nearly a 25% reduction. In disability, it's a 15% reduction, and on and on and on. There's not one single department that has spared any reduction in this proposed budget. This budget also represents the continued priority that the mayor and the council has maintained along public safety, and approximately 70% of it is dedicated to police and fire. The remainder goes to the rest of the city family. That includes public works, the city attorney, and of course in the area of parks and rec and library, while they are generated, these dollars do represent general fund dollars, they are directed by charter. So at the end of the day, the city council and the mayor don't have authority in being able to change these targeted amounts. This budget also proposes a reserve fund that will close at the end of the fiscal year at approximately $284 million. As I indicated, the balance of our reserve for this fiscal year will be at $121. When you subtract loans and loan repayments of $22 million and add $18 million of early reversion and encumbered funds and $166.8 million of miscellaneous receipts, mainly through strategies that the mayor has laid out, it is the target to have a reserve fund of approximately $284 million. The next slide will demonstrate in context what that looks like. The final bar chart is what the targeted reserve fund is under this budget, and that represents a 6.5 of the overall general fund budget. And but the chart right before that, that's only green, is what we start with. But the important thing to look at in the context of the last 10 years is that the reserve fund has fluctuated while steadily grown. It has been a moving target. And I think it's been clear by the deliberations of your council that there is a commitment to maintain a reserve fund at least 5% as we move forward in the next fiscal years. And certainly the recent downgrades and concern that we've heard from Wall Street demonstrate the value of maintaining that commitment. There's been a lot of discussion about the changes in the projected revenue, and we wanted to simplify, find a simplified way to demonstrate what those changes represent. Let me be clear about the most significant change that has been discussed. There has been when we introduced the financial status report, we were at the height of the recession. We were anticipating that the recession was going to continue and our revenue would continue to demonstrate that decline. And so we provided a revised version of our estimated revenue that is represented by the green bar in this chart, the green line. What we did in the course of the budget process, we looked at our revenue estimates and were able to conclude that the recession has indeed began to slow down. And while we are far behind where we should be as what was anticipated when the budget was originally adopted a year ago, it is slightly better than what was projected in the financial status report. This change represents a 1% difference. A 1% difference to the better, which is a positive sign, but certainly not the panacea. And while we could see the light at the end of the tunnel, we're hardly away from out of the woods at this point in time. We still have a long way to go before we reach the kind of revenue that we experienced at the height of the boom in the last decade. And if to remind you, during the last major recession that we experienced in the 90s, it took the city over 5 years to recover those revenues. So what we're starting to see is the leveling off of the decline and a very slight increase in the projected revenues. And at the tail end of this report, we'll demonstrate where we see those. Now, what does all of this mean as it relates to the projected budget in the future? And there was comments about that, and I think it is important to look at it within that context. If this budget were to be approved, it would significantly reduce the projected deficit that we had projected a year ago. And to remind you, if we could go to the next slide, we expected the deficit for 11-12 to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $785 million. This budget reduces that to $234 million. Still a deficit, and we'll show you why we still have one, but it reduces it significantly. The next slide. The next one, please. The principal drivers behind our growing deficit continue to be the costs of our workforce. And while this budget recommends reducing the overall size of our workforce, there is a continual cost in both our pension costs and our health care costs. And those costs continue to rise at a pace that exceeds the revenue that we're anticipating in the future. If you move to the next slide, specifically, this particular slide demonstrates the growing contribution to our pension system in the last 10 years, and next year is anticipated to be at over $800 million. This slide is very telling in terms of the overall cost of health care, not just in the city, but in the nation as a whole. In the last 10 years, the healthcare cost in our civilian workforce has doubled from where it was. Back in 2001-2, our healthcare cost was about $103 million. This budget assumes a healthcare cost of $218 million. And you can see that there's a slight drop the following year because we're assuming that there'll be a reduction in the overall workforce. Addressing these principal drivers is a critical part of an overall solution to sustaining the city's fiscal health. And we will continue to explore ways to do this that transcend even the traditional budget cycles that we engage in. I know there's been a lot of interest in understanding our revenue, and so we'll dedicate the next series of slides just on the revenue assumptions so you could see how exactly we got to the assumptions that we have now. Well, we take in consideration the current economic climate in the city, the continued high unemployment rate that we unfortunately are experiencing, what our sales tax comparisons are to other jurisdictions, what our property tax looks like in terms of assessed values, how it looks like in terms of our hotel taxes, and our overall picture as it relates to the documentary transfer tax. The first slide on revenue specifically looks at the sales tax, and many argue that this is sort of the canary in the mine tax that is the most sensitive as it relates to the economy. The red line represents the unemployment rate, and the darker line represents the decline in sales tax. What we're seeing is that we've at least stopped increasing the unemployment rate has stabilized, and that's something that we're seeing nationally, not just in Los Angeles. But unfortunately, what we're not seeing is a significant decline. And most economists agree that this is going to be a very difficult recovery that unfortunately is going to maintain a high level of unemployment throughout most of it. So while we're anticipating a slight improvement in our sales tax, it's very modest in somewhere in a neighborhood of about 5%. Overall, the U.S. retail sales continues to improve, however. And so that indicates to us that while we're lagging behind the national economy, that the future could in fact be a brighter one as we forecast what our anticipated revenues will look like as it relates to sales tax. This next slide shows how we compare to the projections at the state. And overall, the city's receipts are several months behind state receipts, but state receipts are beginning to show a sign of stabilization. And so our projections reflect a similar pattern. And on a quarterly basis, what the most important thing to discuss is that if you look at the sales during the holiday months, where a significant portion of the annual receipts come in, we actually saw a much greater improvement than what we anticipated in the financial status report. And so what we're assuming is that in the beginning of later this year, we're actually going to start seeing being in the positive as it relates to our sales tax. As it relates to property tax and the assessed value, the important pattern to look at is the pattern related to the last serious recession in the mid-1990s. If you'll notice, we see a similar pattern that we are experiencing at the tail end of where we're at now, where we saw a series of decline and a serious drop at the end of that. The question is, after this quarter, should we anticipate a further drop in assessed value, or could we actually start seeing a slight improvement while still below the line of where we should be, better than what it is now? And then finally, or well, almost finally, we also are seeing an improvement of our city hotel tax revenue. We didn't experience the same kind of decline as we did after September 11th, but we did experience a very significant one. And what we're starting to see a pattern of upward mobility as it relates to overall receipts, meaning that more people are visiting Los Angeles and staying in our hotel rooms. And finally, our documentary transfer tax. As you know, this tax demonstrates more than anything what the activity has been in terms of sales of property. And so while property values are still significantly below where they were several years ago, that in fact has resulted in more robust sales and transfer of property than anticipated. So our projections reflect that. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to provide a quick summary, and we can certainly answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. We'll have the CLA make a presentation, and then we'll get into questions.
Karen Kalfine with the CLA's office. My comments will be very brief. Over the course of the next, today and the next week, of course, the committee will be considering the mayor's proposed budget, and we'll be hearing from each of the city departments regarding the budget. During that review, we would highlight just a few things for the committee to consider. One with which Mr. Santana has already touched on, and those are the revenue assumptions, particularly those associated with one-time revenues, which are being used to balance the budget and to fund the reserve fund. These include parking money and documentary transfer tax, other things that have been mentioned. In addition, one-time expenditure deferrals, including furloughs and capital improvement deferrals, the overall impact on city services of the reductions that are being taken in the budget, and overall how this budget and future budgets will address the structural deficit that we have in the city and get the city on the road into financial health. So those are some of the things that we would highlight and over the course of the next week or so.
Okay. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is we can just concentrate at this time on the revenue so that we can get some clarity as to exactly what size budget that we're working on. And then before we start bringing departments, I think Mr. Weezer had a question on revenue, and then Mr. Rosenthal.
Yes, for the mayor's office, you're recommending a reserve fund of 6.7%, I believe?
6.5%.
6.5%.
Yes.
And our annual goal is how much?
Well, the financial policy state a minimum of 5% in the reserve
5%.
fund of the general fund.
Why the additional 1.5%?
Well, again, our reserve fund is anticipated to be what's available at year end. We do agree with the CAO in terms of the starting reserve fund to be at 120 million or 121 million, which is below that financial policy. The way our reserve fund is built up through the year is with the proceeds from the optimization of the parking structures and meters. And it's not until those proceeds come into the reserve fund, which we agree are one time, will the reserve actually end up being at the 6.5. And because we wanted to deposit as much of those proceeds into the reserve fund, that's what's taking it beyond just the 5%.
Okay, and how much is 1.5% in dollars, more or less?
1.5%, just quick math, I think it's somewhere to the tune of $60 million.
Okay, so why not, in this tough budget year, we're going to clarify exactly how much is our deficit. We have different numbers being thrown out there, but why not use, even 1%, 0.5% of that to put it in our anticipated revenue and put it in our deficit?
Well, I think primarily because we wanted to use as little one-time revenues for ongoing purposes. And
this is one-time money that we get.
Yeah, we recognize the fact that our proposed budget does use $53 million of that parking optimization as part of the budget. We wanted to avoid using any more, and so that's why the reserve fund, we anticipate, will be 6.5%.
That's right, it's going to be one-time money too.
Councilman, the number that you're seeing is a target. It's not money that we have in hand today. And so it's based on a strategy to optimize the use of our parking assets that while optimistic, is still not clear if we're going to be able to reach that level. So, the added amount, it may represent some of that projection, but it's exactly that, it's a target. The only dollars that we could actually count on in the reserve is the $121 million that we're going to end this fiscal year. Outside of that, there's no other dollars that we currently have that we're recommending transferring over to the reserve fund. As it relates to the long-term lease of our parking garages, which is a portion of that, we are, moving forward on that. We recently issued an RFQ where we received 15 bids from financial institution and parking companies from throughout the country. We will be coming to your council in the next few weeks with a sort of an outline of sort of negotiation points so that we're clear as to the parameters that we have based on the policy decisions that your council makes. And then following that, we're going to engage in a series of negotiations with those companies that remain interested. We're hopeful to have the entire deal done by the first quarter of the fiscal year, where it's not only completed as a process, but we actually have, a check in hand to put into the reserve fund. That's only a portion of what's being represented in the projected reserve fund target that the mayor has in its budget. The rest becomes through strategies related to meters, not necessarily the long-term lease of our meters, but better utilizing the revenue that they generate.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick question. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a new day for us here. When you talk revenue streams, the unions met with me yesterday, and I know what they told me, and this is what they said. In California, lawmakers passed the mortgage relief bill. That was SB 1137. It's a state law that mandates banks maintain foreclosure properties or be fined. The bill authorized the City of Los Angeles to impose civil fines and penalties for failure to maintain their property of $1,000 a day for each violation. On December 11th, 2009, the City Council unanimously voted to implement the enforcement program, establish registration, and maintain requirements and associated fees and fines for properties in foreclosure in the City of Los Angeles. The ordinance is being drafted pending final council approval. From what I gather, the City of Richmond has started to issue fines to banks who fail to maintain their foreclosure properties and have already issued approximately $1 million in fine revenue based on a handful of foreclosures. What the unions suggested to us is that the banks, which are the lenders, that if we moved aggressively on this, we could bring in a revenue stream between $60 million and $116 million. And they see that as a conservative figure. It's the first time I heard about this kind of a revenue stream. I would like you to look into it and report back or make a comment now as well as report back.
It's the first time I heard about it, too, when it was presented by the coalition, and I think it's something worth looking into. We have assigned this particular task to David Luther in our office. I know the CLA is also looking at it, and we're hoping to have a response not only to this proposal, but to all of the proposals in the coalition budget later this week, if not early next week.
Great. Did you want to say something, Jerry?
Yeah, very briefly. I think when you're talking to City Attorney and Building and Safety, I think you need to explore the status of that ordinance. My understanding is City Attorney is waiting for some information on Building and Safety on enforcement costs to put into that. I will say that preliminarily, those revenue estimates look to be extremely large. It appears as though they were based on the total number of foreclosed properties in the city going back to 2007. So those are not necessarily properties that are currently in foreclosure. It's a much lower number. Our estimates are that there's somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 properties in the city that are currently in foreclosure. So it is a source of revenue. It's something we need to pursue aggressively. It's something that City Attorney and Building and Safety need to get done. But it's doubtful that anything close to $60 million is going to be there.
Thank you. Let me just follow up before we go on the question. On that issue, but the property has to be in some disrepair. I mean, so it's not only the gross number of properties, they have to be in a certain condition for you to apply that law.
Yes, ultimately this is going to be an enforcement and a complaint-based issue. For the most part, they're going to be properties that are vacant. So properties that are in foreclosure, that are rental properties, for example, there already are prohibitions about, moving tenants out and minimum standards of maintaining those properties. So even though there are 6,000 or 7,000 that are currently in foreclosure, only a fraction of that would actually likely be subject to any enforcement action.
Thank you. Mr. Zai? I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chair. The issue on the parking garages, which hopeful revenue source possibly, how many other dollars do we have in that hopeful that aren't really solid, but anticipation if this happens or that happens? I heard parking meters, parking garages, maybe some of the other issues that they're talking about, leasing or selling excess city property. On the budget for the reserve, how many items, how many subjects, how many parcels, whatever, do they have allocated? It's a possibility that may bring in revenue.
Targeted for the reserve fund, there's only those two that I talked about. The long-term assets of our parking garages, and as I indicated, we've made a lot of progress on that issue, and I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to reach closure on that issue in the first quarter of the next fiscal year. The second one is something that we're exploring and your council has not acted on, and that relates to optimizing the revenue that we get from our meters. What your council has approved is granting the Department of Transportation the authorization to improve the quality of the meters as soon as possible. And what they've been able to do is identify a technology that simply replaces the head of the meter to allow the use of credit cards and the use of remote technology so they could be better tracked by our personnel. The idea of a long-term lease on the meters has been pretty much put on the table for now, and instead we're looking at how can we maximize the use of the revenue. This new technology, if implemented in 80% of those meters that are the most producing, could generate an increase of our overall revenue by 30%. And we're hoping to have that rolled out at the beginning of the fiscal year and do it rather aggressively. If we're able to increase the revenue and concurrently seek out a way to securitize that revenue for a one-time infusion of dollars, then that would allow a further additional dollars for the reserve fund. But again, the second piece hasn't, the idea of securitizing those dollars hasn't been approved by your council. What has been approved has been the use of improved technology, which the department is moving forward aggressively.
Without those dollars, then what do we have in the reserve fund?
$121 million.
Starting July 1st, that's what we have.
It's higher now, but because we're going to have to rely on the reserve fund to close out the budget, we'll end up at 121. One of the important things that your council did as part of this year's budget is that it maintained a commitment to have the reserve fund be 5% of the overall general fund budget, which represents, over $200 million. If you remember in the chart that I showed you, that was the first time in the last 10 years that we hit the 10%. And it's a good thing because we were able to now utilize a portion of that to mitigate the shortfall for this fiscal year. If you recall, when we presented the financial status report, we were anticipating even a greater dip into the reserve fund, and I know council members, specifically Councilman Weezer, expressed serious concern about that. And fortunately, as a result of the actions that your council has taken in reducing the positions and even the layoffs that we've adopted so far, we're able to mitigate how much we're dipping into that reserve. So we're still ending up at 121, which is significantly better than what we originally anticipated.
And one more, someone sent me a note that part of the national health care, there's going to be a 3.8% sales tax on real estate transactions. Is any of that coming our way? 3.8% sales tax on real estate transactions. Can we look into that and see if there's any revenue that would come our way from that?
We could look into it. You're saying it's part of the health care?
Well, according to the information I received, part of that, the new health care bill calls for real estate transactions subject to 3.8% sales tax. So if you're selling a parcel, 3.8% sales tax, a real estate transaction, 3.8% sales tax. And I know that real estate comes to the city, to the county. I don't know if that's additional or taken away from us, but there's a 3.8% that they're discussing. Mr. Forecaster.
Rex Oloff with the CAO will certainly look into that. That's an enormous sales tax. Our tax is 0.45%, and they would be buying into a very volatile revenue, so you'd have to get sick during the peaks. We will look into it.
Well, it says here, if you sell a home for $400,000, it's going to be $15,200 tax under the 3.8%. And we traditionally receive that in the city and the county. And I don't know.
It's a local source of revenue up until right now.
Well, if it becomes a national source of revenue, it may hurt our bottom line revenue, so we may want to look into that.
We'll look in.
Thank you.
Mr. Smith?
Thank you. On the reserve fund, Mr. Santana, your projections call for $121.2 million reserve fund on June 30th this year. Does that include the $73 million transfer from Warner Power?
3.8%.
Yes, it does. It assumes that we'll receive that transfer.
And that assumption is still very much up in the air today, so that could drop us to 48.
Well, that's probably...
If we do not receive the transfer, then the reserve fund is at a very dangerous point.
Dangerous.
And I think that's, that issue is a bit of a moving target. So at the time that the budget went to print, I think it was, we were very optimistic of receiving it. Hopefully, we still continue to receive it. But it's a major component in being able to have that kind of reserve fund.
Okay. And I just had breakfast with the President of the Commission a couple of days ago, and this is very, very iffy still today. Until the Council resolves this issue, which we took an action on today, that is not going to happen in their mind unless the increase approved by the Council last week is a full year because they lose their bond rating and other issues associated with it. And their Council tells them they can't guarantee the calculation works if they don't get the full year. So this is still very much in flux at this moment because the Council hadn't resolved that issue yet. Okay, on the next page, on the same issue of reserve fund amounts, you predicted $288 million at the end of the next fiscal year, and that assumes assumption one of the $73 million, but also an assumption of $252 transfer of the following year from Water and Power? 257. Right. $5 million. I'll give that to you. But that's very problematic because, one, they didn't reach their targets this year, and two, they're telling us that their revenue streams won't support that next year, and that I think that is a very high amount. I really don't think that's realistic at all, based on what happened this year, on the fact that their revenue streams continue to drop. Even if an ECAF adjustment comes in, their revenue streams continue to drop. We continue to buy more and more renewable power, which costs twice as much money than regular power. So the other issue, I think our Water and Power Department, which used to be one of the most stable in the country, is falling into the same trap we were a year and a half ago, where they're beginning to see tremendous erosion of their financial health. And so I think that's a very unrealistic number, and we'll have that discussion as we go through the revenue streams. And finally, on page 25 of your report, you talk about property tax change in assessed value. And as I look at your chart, which you had, so you don't know what 25 is, your chart, in comparing it to the 1993 through 98 recession, which was much more shallow than this was, and predictably by most economists this would be much longer. Yet your first year or so is much less impact than was in the 1990s. Are you predicting that we'll go into a very, very deep fall-off if we follow that same trajectory next year, or do we know? And phase two of that question is, was this calculation done understanding that the county assessors already begun a devaluation process? Did they do that in the 1990s? I don't think they did, but if that changes the equation considerably.
Rex.
What this is the county's assessor's estimate What's going on beyond that is much more speculative, but this is very close to what the assessed value will be during the budget year. They're within a few months of a final number. Comparing this to the prior recession has all sorts of pitfalls. The recession went very long in Southern California in the 1990s, much longer than the U.S. considered it a fairly mild recession. It was terrible here, and it did affect real estate, but not as severely as this last one, and this was a big hit. What happened is it took several years. It dropped, but it didn't go negative until there was actually economic recovery. The property tax with Proposition 13 formulas lags the economy. The assessor staff tells me they don't believe next year will be the year after, the year ending 13, will be as bad as the year ending 12 and the year ending 11. I don't know that. It's very possible, based on what we've seen in the past, that the year ending 12 is going to be as bad or even worse than this one. We just don't know that. But certainly the property tax trails the economy. That's what we can see from this.
Yeah, it's always at least 12 months behind, 24 months sometimes. And I think the only thing that would skew this, obviously, is back in the 95, we had the total crash of the aerospace industry in the San Fernando Valley primarily, which really drove property values deeper. Yet, across the city this time, we see a deeper cut in property values as a citywide
I'm sorry that I forgot, but one of the big issues here, the big drop in 95, 96 was earthquake related.
Yeah, that's true.
I said, so we're not scheduling one of those.
Yeah, well, don't be surprised if it comes up and creeps up on us. Thank you.
Mr. Kretz?
Yeah, I look at this a little bit differently. I think we know we have, in addition to just our economic problems, a general structural shortfall. But we've done a lot to address it, between early retirements and transfers, 3,000 or so, give or take, from our workforce. We have a lot of efficiencies we've identified and hopefully will be moving forward on. So I think we've done some of that. What I don't understand is why we're increasing a rainy day fund, our reserves, to record levels in the middle of a rainy day. We're in the worst recession in the last 80 years. I don't know that the expectation is that we achieve the highest reserve ever right now. I think it's a good mission, but I'm not sure that I'd be putting my money there. Certainly some of the $160 million that we're talking about increasing from now until the end of the next fiscal year could be used to eliminate all of the coalition layoffs that we're still talking about, and then we could save ourselves the $32 million or so that we think we lose because we give a raise that no one's actually really wanting to have happen. I think it would make much more sense to skip those layoffs, take some of that money out of the reserves, avoid all the costs relating to the layoffs, which is $32 million, and unemployment and multiple other things, and the disruption of bumping and the costs of that. I would like us to look at using that money for something more productive, still increasing our reserves back over $200 million, which I think would be great in this circumstance, and then moving on from there. So I'd at least like to put that on the table as something that we should be striving for, rather than setting the record for increasing reserves during this terrible recession. I don't know if you've thought through that option or not, and what your thoughts are.
Well, I think, again, what the mayor's budget proposes is a target reserve. It's not, if those were dollars we had in hand, I think that your idea of utilizing that funding, those funds versus putting the reserve may be something to consider. But the fact is that those are not dollars we have in hand. Those are dollars that are being projected through an initiative that we still need to pursue. And if and when that initiative is pursued, we're not anticipating actually seeing the benefit of that initiative till the last 2 quarters of the fiscal year. So it's not like we have that money sitting in some bank account that could be utilized for the purpose of mitigating layoffs. To go to to the first point you made about the reduction overall, all the work that has been done, I think you're absolutely right. I think many of us we're pleased to see that while no one wants to see any layoffs, I think we all anticipate a much larger number of layoffs as a whole. And that is as a result of the significant work that's been done by your council and by the mayor to encourage as many people to move from the general fund to special funds to do all the various initiatives that are laid out. And so there's certainly going to be every attempt to reduce that number even further. As early retirement, the final phase of the early retirement moves forward with almost exclusively special funds and proprietaries, there's going to be a lot of movement, hopefully, to try to get people placed in those positions if they're not general fund positions in particular. So, but again, you know, in terms of the reserve fund, I think it's a matter of how much of it do we have in hand versus how much of it we're projecting.
I just hope that we're keeping in mind, as we reduce layoffs and continue to reduce layoffs, the penalty that we pay for laying anybody off with our deal with the coalition, the fewer layoffs there are, the less sense it makes to do any of them at all, because we do pay substantial penalties for that. And when we get down to this number, it kind of stops making fiscal sense, especially if you get to the point where you're saving less than $32 million and then spending $32 million plus other related costs. I hope we keep our eye on the ball in that regard.
And I think if layoffs were all that was proposed in this budget, I think you would make a point that's worth considering. I think part of the challenge of this budget also includes a significant number of furloughs. Furloughs represent $63 million in the overall solution to this budget that impact all, and it's recommended that it impact all employees with the exception of those in special funds and proprietaries and a handful of other positions that are revenue generating. So while we may mitigate to a degree the impact of the layoffs, we still have a significant hurdle when it comes to the amount that's targeted for furloughs. And I would hope that any solution that we come up with at the end of the day balances both of those areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, just three more little follow-up quick questions. First, I think it was Mr. Weezer mentioned the meters. 17 to 19% of the meters are broken. And obviously, I'm hoping DOT has a plan to fix them and see what kind of revenue generation we get out of it. Secondly, the unions, again, another suggestion was hire 50 more people in DOT so you can do more code enforcement, more parking restriction issues, and they would generate revenue for themselves. I just throw out any revenue-generating position should never be eliminated, but worked with so that the revenue stream they bring in. And I look forward to DOT talking about that. And last is some of you have met with a constituent of mine who keeps talking about enforcing the codes and planning and building and safety. There's politics that many of us have to deal with, but have we any insight into the idea of a revenue stream from planning and building and safety based on code violations?
I mean, in terms of DOT, I think, as I mentioned, there is a plan to improve the majority of our revenue-producing meters in very short order. And they do have a plan, and I think a very good plan to do that. And when we have the department up here, they can certainly walk through it. Yep. On the issue of code enforcement, you know, we try to, I think there was an attempt to try to mitigate as much as possible any impact on that department, given that, you know, there's a direct correlation with the economic activity that takes place. But we could certainly get more into that when that department is presented.
Very good. Thank you.
Let me start off with some questions. One of the things I'm concerned with, and the reason that we wanted to deal with revenue right off the bat, is that when you mentioned the greatest possibility we have is $121 million in the reserve fund, and I think it's important to establish that entirely would be our emergency reserve. That would have no contingency. All right. And the second issue of the 121, the target of 73, which we do not have and we have, at this moment, no expectation of receiving, is part of that 121. So my concern is as we go through these numbers and we look at the 73 that's not there, we look at the parking meters that are not there, we look at the parking lots that are not there, and then we take money and, on the one hand, if we stick it in the reserve fund, we can say we're going to pump it up later. But really, the most serious issue I have is when we put $53 million into fees and fines and then spend it. That's money that we have never seen the document. We've not approved a financial report to move in that direction. And so we pumped up the city's revenue by a minimum of $53 million and a reserve fund by 73 on money that doesn't exist. And what bothers me is that I don't believe if we today knew this money wasn't available, that we'd have this budget here. I would think we'd have another budget knowing that $150+ million just is not forthcoming. And in the past, my understanding, the way we've done it, if we think money's coming, and although we project existing revenues, but if we were projecting a new revenue, we stick that over into the UB until it materializes. We don't stick it in the budget and then say, let's spend it. And I think the other issue that I'm concerned about, if it's a one-time windfall, we generally try not to stick it in the operational budget, so next year we'd say, whatever happened to the 70 million, and we'd look at each other and say, we don't know. It just went away. And so these are kind of the crux of why I thought it was important that we get into the revenue, and I haven't gotten to my questions about the specific revenues, but these are the things I think we have to get some answers, because it gives us as a committee an understanding, are we dealing with a $4.3 billion budget? Are we dealing with a $4.2 billion budget, or a 4.1? And I don't want, as a committee member or the chair, to spend the next 12 months slicing up the budget that we knew July 1st didn't exist, much of what we did last year or this year. So how do we come to grips with what is the real dollars and what do we put on the table as to the real budget, so as we bring departments in, we can give them a real financial plan. Otherwise, we're betting on the come that money comes in. We're betting on plans that will get approved by the council that no one has seen, and then we move forward and have a play budget for July 1st, and then the first budget meeting we have in July, we start tearing it apart. That, in my judgment, is not the way we should continue, and I don't want to go through the experience we did this year with $320-some million in shared sacrifice that didn't materialize, and now we have a couple $100 million in revenue projection, or targets, as we say, targets, but we can't spend targets, is in the sense of what, so we need real figures before, in my judgment, we can progress. And without real figures, then we're coming up with a pretend budget. And so maybe the three of you can respond to that. These are issues that I think are relevant, that we have to come to grips with before one department shows up and we're beginning to ask them about their budget, and we don't know what the budget is.
Well, I think you certainly present an alternative way of looking at the budget. The mayor's budget is exactly that. It's his budget in terms of the way it reflects his level of optimism about being able to achieve some of these goals as it relates to the transfer, as it relates to the parking garages, and the maximization of the meters. If there were an alternative view, which I think is the one that you present, then the question would be, where would be a more appropriate place to park those dollars, and the UB could certainly be one place to do that, and then what does that do to the remaining budget? If it was the direction of this committee that it at the end of the the ultimate recommendation that it makes, it must have a reserve fund that's at least 5%, then you would have to then increase the deficit or identify reductions accordingly to be able to transfer dollars into the reserve fund. The portion of the budget in the mayor's budget that is identified through these funding sources is about $53 million from the maximization of the meters, and so that would add an additional hole in the budget, and I would hope that we would then identify corresponding reductions. I agree with you that the last thing I would hope that we end up doing is having a budget that still maintains an enormous gap in, that we don't have any real direction as to how to proceed in, and engage in sort of the kind of corrections that we had to go through this fiscal year. I think there's only so much of that we can maintain. So that would be based on the perspective that you laid out, that would be an alternative approach to handling the budget.
Okay. Councilmember, I would agree that it's been a very painful process this year trying to achieve those shared sacrifice targets, which is precisely why I mentioned in the opening remarks that we haven't put in a shared sacrifice target in any department, and instead are relying on the position eliminations and yes, furloughs to start generating the savings from day one. Now, to the extent that we did identify some one-time revenues, you're correct. These are one-time revenues that are based on policy decisions that have not all gone through the council vetting process, and we do hope that these one-time revenues come to fruition. But it was one of those decision points that we had to make, whether we identify the additional cuts that were going to be even more painful than what we have today, or we try to identify one-time revenues, and be they one-time revenues, to try to offset some of those cuts and hopefully bridge us to a fiscal year with some where the economy rebound is being felt.
Yeah, but I think even if we look at as late as yesterday, the state of California's independent analyst says the recovery is not coming in 2010, no matter how much we hope for it, how much we put money in there and say, let's spend it if it comes in, it's not going to happen. And so when we get to the point to where we are today, I think my concerns are all of the money that we didn't retrieve in shared sacrifice, what did we do with it? We pushed it into this year's budget as part of this year's budget that we didn't achieve last year. So that makes it even more difficult. The lessons we learned from this year's budget is that if we had dealt with this issue in years past, we wouldn't be dealing with numbers in the thousand. We'd be dealing in smaller numbers incrementally. And I think we are, in my judgment, are taking off on the wrong foot, is that we started off last year, and this committee disagreed strongly about it, but we started off last year with a almost $4.4 billion issue on the budget. Many of us said you're lucky if you hit 4.1 or 2, somewhere in that area. Within 6 months, we were down to 182. Rather than start our projections from where we actually ended, we started them where we started the year before. And so we then look at it and say, well, we had 4.3 something last year. We were under it by 180. We're now going to start this year at 4.3 something, expecting that 180 not to come about. And I think that's the figures that make it almost impossible to address. And then the dollars that you've identified, even though we've never put our arms around them or seen them, they're all one-time monies that basically do nothing for the structural deficit. So if we pass any semblance of this budget, in 12 months, we'll be sitting here with a structural deficit as big or larger than it is today, because even though we talk salaries, we often forget the 40% overhead, the pension, and all those other things that keep growing geometrically, not just on a linear basis. They keep going by leaps and bounds. And so if we're going to, in the middle of this budget crisis, do something about the structural deficit, then these recommendations should be addressing the structural deficit. If we're going to do something about accurately predicting or projecting our revenues, then we probably should see where we were at year end versus where we started 180 million over the year end. And so it's, again, difficult for me to even begin discussing with general managers what their budgets are if we can't decide within $200 million of what the city's revenue is. And then when we find within the city's revenue a $50 million hole here because we're kind of guessing we're going to cut a deal somewhere, and the reserve fund is really not 120-something, it's really 30-something. All those things, if we go forward, and as you know, with the potential in this city of having an emergency, we starting the year with 38 million on a promise that by June of the next year we might have 121, that's not a firm feeling to be in. We couldn't tell emergency preparedness to hold that earthquake until the cash flow comes in. And so, I mean, and again, these are the major issues I have a concern with in the budget, and we haven't even gotten to whether documentary transfer tax is a little fuzzy and whether you can expect that much, whether sales tax is in the ballpark, whether business tax is going to be where we project it. I'm just talking large pieces, and then we have this one little odd thing in the budget that says, oh, by the way, let's hold off paying our pension payment in July and hold it off for 4 quarters, and we don't even know whether it's more costly to do that within that fiscal year or whether we should take the discount for paying it early. These are all the things that a few million here and a few million there, we could be in really bad shape with all these projections that have not come to fruition in the last couple of years and appear they may not come to fruition this year. So from my perspective, we need some hard numbers for the committee to even begin to do its work. And if money isn't there, we shouldn't count it. If it's not there, we should put it in the UB, and when it comes, we can then circle it and say, if that comes in, here's 12 things we should do with it, or we should put it in the stabilization fund, or we should do something with it other than just go down the path we were last year of let's do something and hope the money comes in. I think we're out of hope that the money is going to come in. Everyone universally throughout the nation is saying the economy is not going to be much different and maybe worse. And so why do we believe that the city of LA is the only one that can create a budget with pretend numbers? And I think that's what we have to come to grips with. Otherwise, I think we're wasting the members' time here coming up with $200 million. We don't know where it's coming from, but let's act like it is, and let's not tell people there may be a layoff, because somewhere down the line there will be. And, so that's what I need from the three of you. What are the real numbers so that we're not sitting here, twiddling our thumbs saying, well, if we just pray a lot, it might happen. I think we're beyond that. I think we can capsize ourselves with some wrong decisions for this coming year. So if you could respond to that and tell us, how do we get the real numbers? How do we get the point that we know if it's 4.1 billion, then let's make the $4.1 billion decisions, and if it becomes 4.15, then let's make that when it comes in. But let's not make $4.3 billion decisions and know we don't have the money.
Well, in terms of the mayor's proposed budget, the amount that it assumes one-time revenue, okay, let's start tearing this apart. Mm-hmm. The amount that assumes one-time revenue is $53 million from, whatever maximization of assets. So,
but again, when we use terms like that, particularly for the public, now we've read the books, and many of us discussed it and said, okay, great term, but what does it mean?
It means the securitization of our meter revenue.
Yeah, okay. That hasn't occurred, that we haven't seen, that many council members have been at arm's distance about doing anything with meters. And so to put 53 million into an operating budget basically sends a very strange message that we're spending money that's not there. The other thing, when we pump up our reserve fund, and I realize we're concerned about the ratings and such, but in reality, pumping up our reserve fund on a false number is almost the same as private industry that pumps up their bottom line so you'll invest in them. And we've seen what happened with those companies. And so I just don't think we should follow that path.
I would just say, though, that both on in terms of the parking structure and the parking meters, these are assets that we own, that we know there's value to these assets. We know there's revenue that comes in relative to the meters. So it's not like if we're just, picking a number out of the air and just plugging it into the budget.
I don't disagree with you. The issue is we know we have meters. We know we have a program that could increase the volume of revenue by 30%. We don't know what that is yet. But on the other hand, saying that we can do some other program, we don't have what that dollar value is, how long those meters revenue will be tied up in order to get this money. And then if you get the money and people agree with it, what are you going to do with it if it's one-time money you push into the budget and next year we say, by the way, now that we've done that one trick, what do we do next year? Because we do not have money to back up on that. And if you're going to throw it in the operating budget, it's gone. We'll never see it again, and now the meters are tied up, the revenue's tied up for a number of years, and we're getting no revenue over that period, and we spent the money. So those are not, in my judgment, good decisions to make in good times. They're really bad decisions to make in bad times.
So again, if you look at the overall budget and if you subtract the 53 million, because as you indicated correctly, that the council has not taken action on that concept, and so it remains, it's not confirmed well enough for your comfort, then it would reduce the overall revenue to 4.2 in terms of what 4.282. Now the next question becomes, how do you want to deal with the reserve fund? Now my hope would be that this committee would want to establish a strategy that gets a reserve fund as close as possible to the 5% target, and we'll hopefully have more information in the upcoming weeks, certainly before the fiscal year is over, as to whether or not we get the transfer.
Let me just say one thing on the reserve fund. I think, and I don't know if I can speak for every committee member, I think the goal of 5% is worth striving for. But I think also in this financial crisis, I don't think it's realistic. But whatever's in the reserve fund, I think we'll get a unanimous vote. It should be real. It's money that you actually can get your arms around, and if we have an earthquake or a disaster, or we have to go do something, you actually can reach in there and say, move this money to get this result. If it's not real, the dollar value is meaningless. And so that's the whole issue. But 5% may not be realistic, but if it's 2.5% and it's real, that's better than 5% that's unreal. So that's, I think, what we need. But if we don't have that guidance early on, then, again, we're wasting a whole lot of people's time. And we might as well send the budget with no recommendations and let people go have at it in mid-May, and whatever comes out, comes out. But the reason we're here is to try to make sense of it. And I can't go to my colleagues and say, I feel comfortable with the budget. We have no idea what we're bringing in, but I feel comfortable we're going to spend more than we bringing in. I mean, that's ludicrous. I mean, and all we're doing is adding to the structural deficit, whether we want to or not. And part of our mission, we've said over and over for the last several years, is to reduce the structural deficit for us, because it's in the greatest benefit of the city that one day we'll spend less money than we're bringing in. One day. But if we keep spending more, we'll create a structural deficit that none of us can resolve in the distant future.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that point, sir. Again, this is one perspective of how to proceed on the budget. There are obviously revenue assumptions here that you don't agree with, and so it's at the discretion of your committee to establish a different perspective on that, and that's what I was trying to get to. If you subtract the amount assumed in the budget that is, in your consideration, maybe not as hard as it should be, then that would be the equivalent of about $53 million. And so then the next task would be is to identify whether or not you want to identify additional cuts to mitigate that amount, and then beyond that to determine whether you want to identify a portion that you want to transfer to the reserve, maybe not the 5%, but establish a new target. And I'm here to figure out how to best help you with getting there.
Yeah, just back to your initial presentation, page 17 where you have your graphs. This, of course, is again what Mr. Parks was saying about structural deficit and the issue of structural deficit and how do we focus on it. There's two ways we've been talking about it. One is a new tier for new employees. Is that in any way a proposal being made by you?
In the budget, we do not anticipate any savings from a new tier, although I believe that there has been an instruction to the CAO from the Executive Employee Relations Committee, which is comprised of several members who actually are sitting here today, as well as the mayor, for the CAO to develop what a new tier would look like for both civilian and for sworn employees. And the mayor has, in this budget and in statements he has made, and in those recommendations, has supported the development of new tiers for new city employees.
Okay, so this year might be the first year we seriously put together a plan that would have a second tier.
It's our intent to continue that process in terms of developing those tiers, and obviously this would be something that goes to the Executive Employee Relations Committee.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Mr. Santana, when you look at that chart again, obviously you see it just getting bigger and bigger, and I happen to agree with the analysis here. This year is maybe not the bottom out yet in terms of city government, and it might even be another year when we see things stabilize again. I'm just obviously don't know. But what about the health and dental benefits? I know that there was some state legislation that was floating around on both pensions and that has gone by, and it's not going to happen. How do we address the health issue, and what would be the best strategy on that?
Well, there's different strategies. One of the more tangible ones is incentivizing our employees to pursue health care in a way that promotes their health so that the utilization isn't as extensive as it currently is now. And then also pursuing a different contribution from our employees to our healthcare costs. Our healthcare costs have consistently gone up about 10% for the last 10 years. And the overall percentage that our employees pay for that increased cost has relatively stayed the same. So the city is in a position to absorb the majority of that increase. Now, we don't know how healthcare reform is going to impact all of that, and hopefully it'll make a significant reduction in how in reducing that overall increase. But one of the strategies is to identify opportunities that our employees could contribute more to the overall cost.
Yeah, I think we need to get more specific about that, because the obvious fact is, and some of the folks explained to me, an HMO strategy like a Kaiser, sort of the floor that's been used in creating these relationships. I know I have Blue Shield Blue Cross Preferred, but my doctors have opted out of it, so I'm paying in addition to my premium. The real bottom line for us is, must we up our premium, and should we do it now instead of continuing to talk about it and potentially just make it so burdensome that we'll never be able to get out of the hole? Is there a sense that we can come up with a strategy in dealing with it?
Well, I've received direction from both the ERC and your council on that very point, and I've initiated the first round of conversations that relates to that with our bargaining units.
Okay, well, I eagerly look forward to that, as I do also to the pension discussion. If we have to deal with an uppering our, for instance, we're paying 6% unless you're police or fire, which is 9%. We agreed in last year's deal that in 2011 it would go up to 7%. Is there an opportunity to get beyond the 7 and look at a higher figure that would lessen that structural deficit exposure? Private sector, I'll be candid with you, doesn't provide the kind of support systems, and I understand how government historically did this, but we're in a different era now, and I'm just wondering, how do we do it with gentleness and respect, also respect the union relationships, but not burden our taxpayers with more health costs and pension costs at the reduction of services? That's where the sad part is. You can't reduce services and at the same time take care of your workers. And I don't believe in getting rid of workers either, because that's the services people expect their tax dollars to do. So that's where we're in loggerhead. You're going to be able to give us some insight into that.
Again, I've been given some parameters by your council and the ERC to have a conversation with our bargaining units as it relates to both health care and pension reform. So we started those conversations. We anticipate aggressively pursuing them, particularly for those bargaining units where we have open contracts. So I'm reluctant to discuss the details of that in public because they're all subject to negotiations.
Colleagues, one of the things I'd like to do is we can just let the police and fire know that we're not going to get to them this evening, so we don't have them sitting around. But one of the things I'd asked from the CAO, CLA, and the mayor's office, with these issues we just brought up as far as soft money and things that we have not materialized, and the importance of having a reserve fund, again, realizing it can't be at 5%, the importance of matching the real one-time money with the real one-time expenditures. What kind of effort would it take for you to go through that and bring us the real numbers by tomorrow, so that we then as a committee could know what size budget we're dealing with? Can we get something in that order that gives us something to go for? And if these other things materialize during the year, then we could have these things brought out and understand how we'll spend the money. But until we get to that, we should not be putting, historically our reserve fund has always been money we had in hand. It was never money we projected we're going to get. So we're violating some of our long-term historical principles by doing what this budget recommends. And so what would it take to get us some real numbers, remove the soft money, tell us what we're really dealing with, give us an idea, and we understand by moving the soft money, it's going to create some cuts. The issues are, where do those cuts come from? Because they're hand in hand. And we need to know that, because we need to know it before a department shows up as it relates to them giving what they think is their core responsibilities and the issues they're going to address. So what will it take to get to that?
Well, I think what we could do is, coming up with that by tomorrow, that shouldn't be a problem. I think and we could work with the CLA in identifying what you may consider soft versus hard savings.
Real or not real, whatever the term.
Right.
I would just like to add, certainly you raised some very valid points as far as revenue, and I think certainly the $53 million has been called out as one particular big pot of one-time money. I think we had discussed sort of going through the revenues, and so then the question becomes, as we go through all the other categories, property tax, sales, the DBP transfer, what is viewed as being soft? Certainly as we put the estimates together, we view that they are reasonable, they are in the ballpark.
Let me give you a list of what I think is soft.
Then that's perfect.
What I think is soft are funds that we are projecting, such as parking lots and meters, that we haven't even vetted yet. Because no one knows what those are. So wherever those are, they need not to be in the budget at this time. I think the other issue is to rely on the 73 and the 247 on power transfer before you come to some realistic idea, are they coming? Because whatever you do this year is going to move over to next year. So the 257, if it's high for next year, creates a hole next year. If the 73 doesn't come, that meets a hole this year and a bigger hole next year. So the reality is, again, we get a power transfer. I thought by the charter and everything else that they made their decision somewhere around the end of the fiscal year that 220-something was coming. Now, the hostage game we've been playing over the last several weeks, in my judgment, is a travesty. Because the thing is to say, on the one hand, we can give you 92 million or 93 million if you give me a increase for a year, and I can give it to you before the increase is even in place, I think insults our intelligence. But it's not here. So I don't think you can stick it in the budget and say it's 257 next year and 73 this year without knowing that. I think also that when we look at this issue of how the one-time money is being spent, if it's spent on multi-year issues and it's in that imbalance, that creates, in my judgment, a bigger hole. And so we got to match that together. I think also that if we look at things like documentary transfer, I think that's a little fuzzy as it relates to not massive, but is a little fuzzy as to whether we can rely on that figure. And don't get nervous, Roy, I'm not saying anything to you yet. The other side is that, let's see, if we talk about the reserve fund I mentioned earlier that doesn't have all the money in it, the fact that we're not addressing the structural deficit in the sense that we're dealing with furloughs primarily as opposed to layoffs, which we know is a structural change. Those are just a handful of things. The delay in pension. What's the cost of that by delaying it 4 quarters versus paying it with the discount? Those are just a handful of things I picked up in just a cursory reading of the budget. And so those who put it together, I'm sure, would have even a greater understanding that there's other soft money, And so these are things I would think at a minimum we'd go at, and we can argue back and forth about sales tax, whatever, and all that other, but these are real hard items that need to be resolved before we move one step farther in the process, in my judgment. Anybody else have a comment or concern?
Mr. Chair, I think all of your points that you've made thus far are well taken. We certainly don't want to be in a situation where we are in a constant stage of cutting like we were in the current year. However, bear in mind that as we prepare the budget, it's always a plan. It's a plan of revenues versus a plan of expenditures. And the best that you can do is to make a projection based on your best estimates as far as, what you expect to receive in terms of revenue. I think that this CAO has taken a rather cautious approach on the majority of the revenues. There are a few that perhaps may be a touch high and it may be of some concern. What is of greater concern, though, are the revenues on which are counted that have not come before you for action yet. And those two things are the ones that you've talked about, primarily with regard to the parking meter securitization, and also the bringing in of some of the parking lot monies to balance the budget. So that is certainly of concern. One area that you might consider focusing on in terms of trying to bring this budget more in balance with the revenues that we think we're going to get. There's a page in the CAO supporting document that refers to the use of one-time revenues. And maybe the first step towards that would be to balance your one-time revenues with your one-time expenditures. Right now, your expenditures in the proposed budget exceed your revenues by $50 million, which coincidentally is about the amount of money that's coming in from the parking lot proposal. So that may be something that you might want to move forward initially, and then bearing in mind that most likely that would entail additional cuts, but the cuts need to be permanent in order to be structural cuts.
And I agree, and I think the issue, and again, I don't want to get in an argument over fees, each one of them, whether it should be 1 million more or less, but I think we can't ignore the point if we put them in the wrong place. If we're proposing that we're going to bring in some money and we stick it in the operating budget and it doesn't exist, we're compounding what problems we have. And so it's not only the dollar, it's where we're placing it. And we've never, in my few years here, have ever taken money that's projected and stick it in the reserve fund as though it's real. We've never done that.
With regard to the projected reserve fund, the amount that is stated, that appears in the reserve fund on July 1 is what's adopted. In terms of what is included in the mayor's proposed budget, there is an expectation that there are other revenues coming in. And you're correct, in sometimes, in a lot of instances, some of those revenues do not come to fruition. So your reserve fund basically is whatever it is. Whatever actions you take, it's your savings account. It doesn't, we don't actually materially affect the reserve fund. Actions are taken, and then your reserve fund is the net result of the actions that you've taken.
No, I agree with that, but again, we've never fluffed them up and said, we're going to stick this in here because we may get some money. It's all about the results of what occurred.
And if it's the committee's concern, if that committee is concerned about that, what you could do is remove that as a potential receivable, and then that changes the projected June 30th, 2011 estimate.
Yeah. And I think, and I give what Ms. Perry has a question, but the other thing I think that's important for all of us is that when we're going through this, if we know what, and again, we all live with the projections, and you can debate them, but if we have some idea of the reality of the budget, we would budget differently than if we said, let's just kind of make up some numbers so that we can balance it. If we know we're not going to hit 4.3 something in the overall revenue, then we would budget materially different if we knew it was 4.1 or 4.2. We'd know that going in. We wouldn't budget the same way if we knew the revenues weren't there. And that's what I'm trying to get to the point of. Ms. Perry?
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't know who should answer this question, but why don't I just ask it? Now, what are we going to do if we don't get the transfer from the Department of Water and Power? And what does that do to your numbers?
It essentially significantly reduces the projected reserve fund at the beginning of the fiscal year. And so that's really where the effect will be felt. Instead of having a reserve fund of 121, we will have a reserve fund minus the 73 that we're expecting to receive from the Department of Water and Power. That's where the greatest impact would be.
Just as a sidebar, and I don't know, Mr. Santana, if you know the answer to this question, but just correct me if the Department of Water and Power does the transfer because they're not obligated to pay property taxes pursuant to the city charter. Is that correct? Sharon may be the better, or because you just got here.
You want to answer that?
Anybody?
Rex, the Department of Water and Power makes the transfer from surplus revenue subject to certain constraints. There are many ideas on why it makes the transfer, but the only significant point is a surplus exists and they declare it and they transfer it to the city. One can look at it as in lieu.
What construct relieves the Department of Water and Power from having to pay property taxes?
Well, they're a governmental entity, same reason we don't pay property taxes.
Okay, and that's pursuant to?
They're exempt. Just
by the IRS code?
No, it's not the IRS code, but state law.
State law?
Yes. Same reason we don't pay property tax on City Hall.
And same for LAUSD, same for...
They're exempt.
Okay.
And Councilwoman, if I can just add to that, historically, the Department of Water and Power was originally a rural city department. It was not a proprietary department. So in theory, part of the purpose of the transfer historically has been to recover the costs of the original investment made by LA citizens in the water and power infrastructure. So this is a long-standing item that has been contained in the charter since probably the early 1920s. I can go back that
there
far.
is language embodied in the charter that
references the transfer, yes.
So does it obligate the department to make the transfer?
No, it doesn't obligate the department because the department ultimately has to be able to declare that a surplus existed. So in theory, if the department is operating and their expenditures and their revenues exactly match, they couldn't make a transfer because that would put them in a deficit situation. So what would happen is at the end of June 30th, they make a determination, they do their financial analysis, and they make a determination that whether they have a surplus. And the surplus, whatever they transfer, typically has been, by board policy, been established as 8% of their gross operating power revenue. So, but it could never exceed net income. So, for example, if the 8% equaled $100 million and their net income was only 80, they can only transfer 80. So this is a long-standing item that has been in a number of city charters, and it was really to recover the city's original investment in a department that was not a proprietary department. It was like, a general services, for example.
So following your logic, the council reaffirmed a rate increase going into effect July the 1st, and if I follow that, prior to that, the department was in a state of undercollection?
The department, with regard to ECAF, yes, is in a state of undercollection. They've been restricted to recover only the 0.1 cent per quarter, and that was the cap that was established by ordinance. Today, with the council's action, or actually with no action, the board action would actually implement the ECAF rate adjustment. But bear in mind that even that does not impact their revenues for the current year. Remember that the transfer for 2010-11 will be based on their revenue that was collected as of June 30th. And the rate increase as adopted by the board does not go into effect until July 1.
Okay. So we have to wait until the end of the fiscal year to determine what the amount of surplus may or may not be.
Well, Water and Power will be able to determine probably towards the end of the current calendar year with regard to what the net or what the operating income, the gross operating income was on June 30th, and that they would be able to make a determination what the 8% would be. Typically, in any given year, the transfer does take place in March, February, March.
Yes, towards the end of the year, yes.
Thank you.
Mrs. Zine?
Projections versus expectations. We talk about projections, we anticipate this, and then expectations. How much of this budget is projections versus expectations? Because one is like fantasy land, and the other's maybe. I mean, if we have something solid, but when I hear about the revenue from the parking lots and the meters, which is far from complete, would that be a projection or an expectation?
That would be an expectation.
And the expectation could materialize or not.
It assumes that the deals go through. It assumes that your council approves them. It assumes that there's a decision to move that money into the reserve and not to mitigate layoffs. There's a number of assumptions related to that.
But how often do we establish a budget with that logic?
Well, this year's budget had a huge hole in it. I mean, this year's budget assumed that we were going to negotiate a number of major concessions from our bargaining unit, and we were able to do that. But when it was approved, it had, I wasn't here, but it had a hole of over $300 million in it. And it had a major assumption that we were going to pass an early retirement program, that we were going to be able to negotiate major concessions from our bargaining unit. So, in many ways, the assumptions were far greater in what was adopted this year than what's being proposed for next year.
Well, we have employees that have sacrificed, there's no question, with the furloughs, with the no increase in compensation, with the increase in the pension contribution, and clearly no overtime, cash overtime for the police, what happens to the fire department. I mean, all those employees have assisted, in my estimation, a great deal to help balance this. But then we're looking at additional revenues to come in and say, we're going to sell this, we're going to sell that, we're going to lease this. I mean, it just seems that it's pie in the sky versus some type of substantial down-to-earth reality that we have something done. And to base something upon that possibility, that supposition, the expectation, the projection, I mean, we can increase our revenues if the economy improves. If sales tax improves, if more cars are sold, et cetera, that's a projection. But when we're expecting something that isn't even brought before for votes, hasn't been resolved in negotiations, which is a major issue, see, I think we're doing a disservice to our employees, we're doing a disservice to everyone when we're putting dollars into that really don't exist.
But I would just add that everything you've said is, I don't disagree with, but I would say that it's within the city's control. It's within the city's control to review these potential initiatives, to vet them, to approve them, and move forward with them. It's within the control of the city council and the mayor collectively.
But the mayor presents a budget to us. He presents all of this. We've torn down the forest of Los Angeles. So now the forest is gone. And we still have the tree trimmers, thank God. But the mayor presents this to us, which we're supposed to review, and I'm new to this budget. I've been around 8 years, but this is the first time on budget. And I would think we'd have something substantial that we wouldn't have to go down to ground zero and then bring it up from the bottom. That the mayor's office would have brought us something that's logical, that's reasonable, that has real facts and figures, and not these expectations, which I think many people are going to say are unrealistic. And base it upon that, waste a lot of time, a lot of energy, and then everybody has to spin their wheels again to build it up. We get the budget based upon what the mayor presents to us. And he presents this, which to me has so many holes in it, we're going to have to patch this from the bottom up. That's a disservice to everybody. So I'm not want to criticize you because you're not the only one. But somehow, whoever put this together with fantasy. And I know medical marijuana is permissible with a prescription, a recommendation. Hopefully no one was doing that. Because I find this really offensive that there's no substance.
I would disagree with that entirely.
Which part? The marijuana?
Well, that too. For
medical marijuana.
For the record, there are substantial structural changes that we alluded to earlier. There's the elimination of positions, and some of them are filled. There are furloughs, and yes, those do generate savings from day one, once they're implemented.
Okay.
Although they're one time, they are real. We've experienced the savings this year, and we expect to experience savings next year as well. Now, as far as the expectations that you raised are concerned, it goes both ways. We expect to receive certain revenues, but we also expect to not over-exceed on our expenditures. And so...
But how can you put in parking lots when it hasn't been finalized or hasn't even been fully vented? How can you put that in there for millions of dollars?
Well, that's actually something that's there's a working group in place now that's the CEO, the CLA, the mayor's office, a number of other departments that are part of this working group. We received a number of bids to be qualified to bid on this project.
But this budget takes effect July 1st.
Yes, and that's why the majority of these revenues are projected to go into the reserve fund. We're not, to the extent possible, we do not want to budget the dollars of these deals into the department's operations. We understood that these are one-time dollars that won't be there next year. We understand that completely. And so that is precisely why the majority of these dollars were placed in the reserve fund. And we understand that the reserve fund on July 1st, it won't be the 284. It's going to be closer to the 120, and it could be less if the power revenue doesn't come through. We understand that. But we also understand that, as long as we have these, it's a zero-sum game. So it's either going to come through the revenues or it's going to come through additional cuts. And we chose to put together a budget where we're balancing more on the revenues, on these one-time revenues, than on additional cuts.
The expectations.
Exactly.
Which are, in my estimation, wishful thinking. And while the economy is improving very slowly, it's going to take a long time to get back to a pace where we're really going to find some substance coming in.
And I don't disagree with any of the points being made relative, the chair made some very valid points. All I'm saying is that, this is a zero-sum game. To the extent that the revenues are taken out of the budget, there has to be something to replace it. Whether it's other revenues that are identified, which I would hope receive the same level of vetting that these revenues being proposed are receiving, or additional cuts.
But if you go back to sort of Sharon's point earlier, if you look at the budget, sort of putting aside the reserve for a second, that assumes some of the soft revenue as the chairman described, we're talking about $53 million. That's the amount that's actually plugged in to help mitigate the overall deficit.
Right.
The remainder, there's still the elimination of 3,500 positions. And up until very recently, those positions had actual bodies in them. They were folks who left through ERIP or transferred. There's actual significant cuts, and I think the chart that we showed that the size of the workforce would be at the lowest point it's been in the last 10 years. It shows it is proposing a structural reduction. Now, there could be a disagreement as to whether it goes far enough. You could certainly replace that $53 million worth of soft revenue with additional cuts, and that's an option that your committee has, and it may choose to do that. And then beyond that, it's deciding how it wants to handle the reserve fund. Most of the soft revenue is targeted for the reserve fund.
Right.
Okay? So you may say, well, agree that maybe it shouldn't be 5% because we're in a difficult year. Maybe we should just bump it up at the emergency reserve and what that amount is. So I think that that's part of what I assume the process is like. The mayor proposes his budget. Last year, there was a lot of healthy discussion around it. There was the same issues raised about assumptions. Meters, the leasing, long-term lease of meters was part of that discourse there, too. This budget has less of the fuzziness that it did the one in the budget we have now. Again, this year, we started the year with a $300 million hole that we spent the whole year basically addressing. So I think that's part of the process that we need to go through. I agree with the chairman. We could certainly come back first thing tomorrow morning, identify those areas in which you outlined that may be soft. And certainly we could start off by looking at those areas that your council hasn't approved. If your council hasn't approved yet, then we will put it on the list as soft revenue. I stand firm on the work that my office did on the assumptions on the revenue, the traditional revenue streams that we rely on. Again, it's a 1% difference from what it was in the mid-year report. We're not talking about an enormous deviation here. It's well within the standard deviation that you would anticipate. And I think you heard Rex outline why we reached some of those assumptions, but we could have that discussion tomorrow. But once we take out that amount that's actually soft, and then you have a new starting base to work from, and then proceed from there.
But I've got one more question to follow up to this. While this budget was prepared, were priorities established to say, these are the priorities of the City of Los Angeles, our functions, our responsibilities, these are the nice to do, but not particularly significant in relation to saving lives and picking up the trash and et cetera? Or was it, this is what we got, and how we're going to squeeze everything in this compartment?
The priorities were definitely established, and in fact, some of those priorities were acted on in the mid-year. As you recall, even this body, the Budget and Finance Committee, several different of the policy committees and the full council acted to eliminate some departments based on those priorities. And this budget reflects the priorities of the mayor, but it also reflects the fact that the deficit we're trying to solve for is a general fund deficit. So we weren't going to be looking at the Bureau of Sanitation, for example, to solve this budget. We were going to be looking at those departments with the general fund dollars.
What's different between the proposed budget and this year's budget we're in, when the mayor proposed last year's budget for this fiscal year, there was across the board equal, everybody sharing in the equal amount of pain. Right. And so what that did, while it was equitable, it put everything on the same list of priorities. Everything is equal. What the mayor proposed this time around is that based on what he believed is the most important, the cuts reflect that. And so there's some departments that are experiencing as high as a 40% cut, some that are receiving less than that. And so you'll be able to see, at least from his perspective, how he identified those priorities. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, just one more question about the DWP transfer. The $73 million that we're still waiting for, isn't that based on the prior year's income? So in reality, there's nothing for them to base withholding that upon, so there's no reason to expect that we wouldn't receive that.
That is the budget basis. They did declare net operating revenue. Their financial statement was available in the fall. The discussion now has to do with current year cash flow. I defer to the board on that, but the historic basis for the transfer of the full amount of $220.5 million exists. And it would be unusual that it did not happen in this case.
Is there any basis on which they could withhold it from us, since they had the money at the time and it was based on that cash flow?
As an action of their commission, I believe. I mean, when we received a letter indicating that they were going to withhold the transfer based on actions that did not occur this fiscal year, it was surprising given that, as you indicated, that the assumption is that it's based on the previous year's revenue.
So in theory, they could argue about the amount that's currently budgeted, but it would be hard for them to come up with a real justification for the $73 million for this year.
Actually, the only criteria that has been used in the past was whether they had sufficient net income. But in this last go-around, what the concern was, as expressed by the department, was their lack of cash flow. And because of that lack of cash flow, they indicated that they could not declare a surplus. So that was an additional criteria that they came forward with in this current year. However, with the actions that they took last week, a week and a half ago, with regard to increasing the ECAF, that should resolve their cash flow issue. However, with regard to whether they are obligated to make that transfer, there's no obligation on their part. They indicated that they would make the transfer, and this was back in March. They indicated that they would be able to make, or maybe in February, that they could make the transfer. But then with what has transpired over the course of the last 6 weeks, there has been a little bit of confusion about that. So we would hope that the cash flow issue is addressed. They certainly had sufficient net income that existed last June 30th to make the 8% transfer. So we wait to see what happens. Just an important note to consider that any transfer that the Water and Power does do is, it must be done by ordinance. So in essence, in order for the funds to be here on June 30th, action would have to be taken on this sometime within the course of the next few weeks, certainly before the end of May.
But other than them deciding to be obstinate for whatever personal reasons, there's no reason in terms of last year's cash, there's no reason in terms of this year's cash flow, there's no justifiable reason that we can see for them not to provide us with that transfer.
It is by charter that they make that determination. They need to schedule it, they need to approve it, and then we adopt the ordinance. We cannot adopt an ordinance and transfer the money without the board's approval.
And if I could answer, if Mr. Koretz, if you'd like, I had a discussion with the president of the board just a couple of days on this point. They're resting their argument on the fact that their legal counsel has advised them that as long as the cash flow has dropped below the $500 million they need in what they call the debt reduction fund, which is currently at $480 million rather than $500 million, that it will severely impact their bond rating for one, and for two, legal counsel says you do not have enough cash reserves to make the transfer. Even though the formula says you should, the cash flow from January onward has dropped precipitously to the point where the money really isn't there to meet the formula that was based on last year's numbers. So that is their argument. And the council then fixed that argument by passing it last week, the point 6, but to the point that there's still an argument about whether it was 3 months or for a full year. Now their legal counsel is still saying we can't make the findings unless it's a 1-year guarantee. So ECAF, if it is only for 3 months, doesn't meet the financial requirements of the department to make the findings to transfer us the money. That is their legal argument that they're resting their hat on. Whether you disagree or not, Mr. Parks and I have another whole point of view that close to $1 billion sitting in their bank accounts should be enough. But they're saying, according to their bond counsel, according to their legal counsel, that does not meet the criteria which they have put upon themselves to make the transfer. So it is still very much a cloud.
I'm just going to comment briefly on that. Is that the fact that they label $1 billion in 2 different funds doesn't mean it's not reserve. Now, they can say all they want legally, it's still $1 billion in liquid cash money. And so eventually it'll get worked out, but I just don't think they should keep insulting our intelligence. They should just say, we're not going to send it, and we all feel a lot better. But one of the things I'd like to comment on our budget today, and I think Miguel and Ben both said the same thing, and this is one of the things that concerns me to some degree. When we say today that we've went out and we decided to address this on the revenue side rather than the layoff side, that would be great if the revenue was realistic. But if we address it on the revenue side today and the money doesn't come through, we're just prolonging the agony of the layoff during the fiscal year, which is going to get larger because we will not end up with a full year of funding. So the fact that we went out and found money and plugged it in there and said we're going to deal with this on the revenue side, and it's not money in hand, doesn't help us at next month and mid-year, because we'll be in the same position we are today saying, is it 1,000, is it 4,000, is it 2,000? Is it 1,200? How many could you get off by June 30th so we can survive? So for me, the cleanest way is to be as upfront as we can today and say, what can we afford? And if we can do better during the year, then let's do better during the year. But let's not get people's hopes up and say, the 4,000, we saw the criticism, the 4,000 went to 750. They must not know what they're doing. The key is, whatever the number is, we should be addressing it. And yes, we realize if we remove revenue, there are cuts that are going to have to come. But it's far better to do it from July 1st to June 30th and get the full year than it is to all of us go through this situation to where we're going meeting by meeting and weekly and saying what's the deal, and then going to EERC and crafting some response. That doesn't help any of us. It just wears us out to where we're budgeting hourly instead of, one time we talked about having a 3-year plan. We have an hourly plan, and I think that's what wears us out. And we need to come to grips with how much money we have, how much of it's real, how much of it's not, and move from that point forward. So anybody else have any questions? If not, then we will recess till tomorrow at 1 o'clock. For those that are on the agenda for today, we'll move all the days on the agendas one day forward, and we will pick up this discussion so that we can have these numbers that come back to us tomorrow on revenue before we get into the departments. And so, yes.
One final question before we begin the broader issue in all these departments. Does your budget, does the mayor's budget identify which bargaining unit each of those layoffs that you've identified, where they belong to, who they belong to?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
For the proposed layoffs in the budget, does the budget identify the bargaining unit?
Yes.
It does?
Yes.
It says there. So we don't, when we're discussing that, okay. And does that, the mayor's budget also include the $35 million that will be in there as a result of a layoff?
The additional cost for the COLAs, for the cost of living, yes, it does.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will recess until tomorrow at 1 o'clock.
He said 9. I don't remember what he said.